Hello, this is David Sullivan from New York City, here to teach you some chess again. Today, we're going to look at some very short games which feature a lot of different openings and all sorts of different tactics. Basically, in the beginning of the game, you're trying to control the center of the board. So what you should be doing is perhaps moving your E pawn, your D pawn, and your C pawn to control the center. But what you don't do is move your H and F pawns, because that causes all sorts of weaknesses, as we're going to see. The weakest spot on the board at the very beginning of the game for both sides are the F pawns. A, B, C, D, E, F. Every square has an address. They go from the left side of the board to the right side. The pawn diagonally next to the white king and the pawn diagonally next to the black king are each considered the weak spot, because those pawns are only defended by the king early in the game. And that's why you see a lot of games go something like this. White will bring up the pawn, he'll bring up the bishop, he'll bring up the queen, and then checkmate black. Now, let's get busy. Shortest possible game of chess. White makes the horrible move G4. Black plays E6. White goes F3. Now, while you're watching this, there's going to be moments where I hope that you pause and try to find the answer yourself instead of letting me just give you the answer. Because if I just give you the answer, then your brain isn't working as much. It's like watching me lift weights, whereas, if you lift the weights, it's going to be better for you. Does anybody see what black should do here? White has opened up the diagonal to his king. Pawns can never go backwards, so black would simply play queen H4 checkmate. Shortest possible game of chess. Now we're going to look at another game, but this time it's going to be shortest game ever between masters. White played D4. Great move. Putting a pawn in the center, freeing up your bishop and freeing up your queen. Black played knight to F6. A very good move. He stops white from putting his other pawn directly in the center, which white wants to do. He would just take the pawn. And what white usually does here is he plays C4. He gets control of a center square. If black puts his pawn in the center, we can take the pawn. If he takes with the queen, we can develop our knight and kick the queen. If he takes with the knight, we can bring our other pawn to the center and make a beautiful center, freeing up more pieces. Let's say the black knight goes back, and then we just develop more pieces. Okay. But in this game, after D4, knight F6, white played knight D2. White wants to put the pawn on E4, protected by the knight, but putting the knight on E2 creates what we call disharmony in chess. Disharmony is when everybody's not getting along really well with each other. And here we can see the knight is blocking the queen and the bishop. Black makes a move E5, which might look crazy to people because the pawn on E5 is unprotected, and white takes the pawn. Black plays his knight to G4, threatening the pawn. And what white should do here is white should make a developing move, defend the pawn, and then maybe black could make another move, attacking it again. Now black has two attackers on the pawn. White could add a second defender to defend against the two attackers. Black could add a third attacker, but then white could add a third defender. And he's holding on to his extra pawn with a good game. But in this game, which makes it so short, after knight G4, white played H3. Okay, everybody, pause and take a look. Black to play. In this position, a lot of people would say, oh, I'll just take that pawn back. And that's a reasonable move. But when you're playing chess, if you see a good move, look for a better one. And that's not my quote. Here, black has an interesting move. He wants to play queen H4 and get at the white king, but the pawn on F2 is in the way. He plays knight to E3, attacking the queen, which is trapped by the disharmony move knight D2 earlier. And if the pawn takes the knight, the diagonal is now very weak. If this pawn was still on H2, when the queen comes in, white would be able to block. But here it's queen H4 check, pawn blocks, queen G3, checkmate. And that's our first game. Game number 2. In our second game, white must have been beating up on black a lot, because the game begins like this. White is spotting black his knight. Okay, so at the beginning of this game, we notice that white does not have a knight. And this actually changes black's strategy right from the start. When you have more stuff than your opponent in chess, like 75% of the time, your strategy is to trade down. When you have, let's say you have if 5 guys are fighting 4 guys, we're gonna have a mini gang war. 5 against 4, it's a wild fight. 4 against 3, 3 against 2, 2 against 1. I'll put my money on the 2 against 1 every time. So by trading, you actually increase your advantage. So black being up a knight, white doesn't have a knight at the beginning of the game, should be looking for trades. Here's the game. White played e4, black played e5. White developed his bishop, bishop f4. He's now able to castle, and he's aiming at the black weak spot. But he's only got one attacker on it at the moment. Black plays excellent move, knight f6, developing a piece, getting closer to castling and attacking the pawn on e4. White is down a knight, so he just blasts away. He plays d4, freeing up more pieces, threatening black's pawn. Black takes. White took the pawn, and then black took the pawn on f2. And here's our first moment of pause, white to play in this game. What would you do as white here? Now, when you look at a position, the first thing you should do is look for checks. And here, white has a check. I mean, you have bishop f7 check. I mean, you're giving up the bishop for the pawn, and I guess you could play something like queen f3 check, the king goes back, and you get the knight. But then when we look at the position, black still has 3 minor pieces, white only has 2. Black is still up a piece. Black is still ahead and winning. So the check isn't too good for white here. Second thing you look for every move are captures. And, I mean, black has made this terrible looking move, knight takes f2. I mean, why can't the king capture the queen? But the reason here is because black has a double attack, otherwise also called a fork. A fork is when we attack 2 things at the same time. Here, this bishop on c4 is unprotected. There's the king. If the black queen goes to h4 check, she hits the king and the unprotected bishop. Let's say white blocks, black takes. So now black has not only won the pawn that he took on f2, but he got his piece back. He got a bishop back for the knight. Plus, he's threatening to like bring out this bishop and give white more grief. Black has basically won the game at this point. So what actually happened here? So instead of taking the knight, white just castled. And black is like, hey, must be my lucky day. Knight takes the queen. But now white has 2 things, the bishop and the rook, aiming at the weak spot. And I'd like you here to take an extra pause and see if you can see the whole thing. The first move is going to be the check, bishop f7. But what comes after that? The king goes to e7, and then bishop to g5 is checkmate. Notice that the pawn on e5 prevents the king from escaping. Okay, back at it with game number 4. This game was played in Kiev way back in 1896. I think the guy playing white was a prince. Here we go. White puts his pawn on e4. Black puts his pawn on d6. White develops the bishop, aiming at the weak spot. Black brought up his knight. White brought up his knight. Black pushed the pawn. White attacks the weak spot. He's got 2 things attacking the weak spot. Black tried bringing the knight up to h6 to defend. Pause. Does anybody see a good move for white? Notice the black queen is totally surrounded. Bishop f7 check. Knight takes f7. Knight e6. And now white wins the black queen and is winning the game. If black wants to continue, his position is much worse. Okay, here we go again. In the next game, I'm going to show black was a master, white was an amateur. But before I start showing that game, I want to talk about the diagonals that can lead to the king. If you play e4 and your opponent plays e5, let's say you play f4 and he takes. If, let's say white makes a bad developing move. When the queen comes in check, There's only one thing that can block on the diagonal. So you've got to be, and actually here is a sample short game. And black comes up a rook. But, so if white plays the pawn to f4, when black comes in check, there's only one thing that can block with the king's gambit. With the queen's gambit, it starts off a lot safer. Because let's say white plays this and black gives the check. Now white has the knight that can block in two ways, plus he has the bishop, and then you have the queen, but of course you don't want to use your queen. And even here, since I developed this knight, you have the other knight, but you wouldn't want to do that either. Why undevelop the knight and block other pieces? So as long as white has the bishop and the knight ready to block this attack, everything's beautiful. Okay, here's our game. White played d4, black played d5. White said to black, hey, come get my pawn. If black takes, I recommend playing knight f3. Usually you'll see knight f6, e3, and then you're trying to get the pawn back with the bishop. This is called the queen's, this is the classical line of the queen's gambit accepted. If black tries to protect his pawn, notice your bishop wants to take, but now this pawn is protected. You undermine the protectors. Now, if this pawn takes, these pawns are all, whoops, these four pawns here, they are extremely weak and unprotected, not protecting each other. White gets his main pawn back. This guy's going to die, and these aren't looking too healthy either. White's doing much better than black. And after a4, if black tries something like c, well, first of all, if black does a6, then when white takes, black can't take back because you get the rook. And if he tries to keep his pawn solid with c6, white just puts more pressure on the pawns. And if black takes like this, white takes like that, and then he's going to get the pawn back. And white's pawns are all connected, while black has this outlier out here, which is a weak pawn, which is going to give him problems for the rest of the game. Okay, so in this game, white didn't take the pawn, white protected his pawn. Black protected his pawn. White developed the knight. Black pushed his pawn up to the center. Now, the way to play against this is called the terrace defense, is you trade pawns. You develop your knight. Whoops, you don't push that pawn. You develop your knight to protect your pawn. If black takes, of course, you take with the knight so that if his knight attacks you, you don't have to run away. And then what I like, you play g3 to develop the bishop. Let's say black develops, you develop your bishop. Let's say he develops, you castle, he castles. And then the play revolves around this pawn and this square, because either white's going to take the black pawn or black's going to take the white pawn. And then black winds up with a pawn that's not able to be protected by other pawns, which is called an isolated pawn. I like to bring up my bishop to aim in front of that square. And you see all sorts of different things like this. You might put the rook on the file. At this point, maybe I'll take, chase his bishop back, and then I'll put my rook on the open line. And then all of a sudden, I'm already threatening to put my knight into better spots and try to give black some headaches. Okay. Now, in this game, after black played c5, white played the much worse bishop to f4. After bishop to f4, black took the pawn, threatening the knight. White took on e5. Black took the knight. And so now black is threatening the bishop and he's threatening the pawn. So white figures that's easy. I'll just play bishop e5. Black took the pawn and white takes back. Does anybody see what happens next here? Once again, you're supposed to pause, take a moment, try to find the answers as much as you can yourself. Here, white's problem is that this diagonal is now tragically weak. When black gives the check, the first thing we look for every single move is check. White can only give things away. If he puts his bishop on c3, the bishop is unprotected. Thank you very much. And then all you have left is queen to d2, and then black takes that and is winning. Of course, white doesn't have to give the bishop, but queen d2, bishop takes, king takes, give me the pawn, check. Black is having a party. Game over. The only thing that black would have to worry about here is, let's say the king moves. You know, you don't want to give him this pawn and your rook, so perhaps you go knight f6 first, and black is just winning this game. Next game. here, we're going to see what's called the Budapest defense. And we saw sort of a Budapest in one of our earlier games. White plays d4, great move. Black plays knight f6, once again stopping white from putting his other pawn directly in the center. White plays c4, black fires back. Now, this pawn looks unprotected, but black will be able to recover it if he needs to. White takes, and actually, usually you see here knight g4. But in this game, black played knight e4. This is called the Farayowitz gambit. And there's one move white really has to watch out for here. And that is pawn to f3. If you push your pawn to f3 trying to chase this knight out of the center, congratulations. You have just opened up your king. And black has the knight controlling squares leading to that king. Queen h4 check, pawn to g3, knight takes, pawn takes, give me the rook. Black is ahead. In the actual game, after knight e4, white was wary of the check, so he played a3. Black played pawn to d6. White took the pawn, black took back, and then white played g3. Okay, time for some very nice chess here. Black to play. This is your moment to pause. Does anybody see what black can do here? The first thing we look for every single move is check. And black does have a check here. Bishop to b4 check. And you might be, oh, that's horrible, because white can just take the bishop. But we have to look at the tactics, and we have to calculate in chess. Here, see, the knight is attacking f2, but the king is protecting it. So black could rip the queens, king takes back, knight takes f2 with a fork. The king will come back, attacking the knight will rip the rook, and then white will round up the knight. Now the knight is dead, so he'll sacrifice himself for a pawn. We look at the position. Black has 6 pawns, and they're all together beautiful. White has 5 pawns, and they're kind of split up. That's better for black. Black has 2 minor pieces. White has 2 minor pieces. The rooks are equal to each other. And then otherwise, it's the rook versus the bishop and the knight, but black has better pawn structure here. I don't know if the viewers will be able to see this, but for my own curiosity, I'm going to turn on a chess program called Stockfish. And Stockfish actually surprises me. It says it thinks that white is doing much better than black. Okay. So if black goes into that line, white is doing better than black. So the check isn't so good, but you're starting off with a sacrifice. You're giving up the bishop. Whereas if black starts with knight takes f2, then he's forking the queen and the rook. If white does whatever, he saves the queen, you can kiss the rook goodbye, and black is already doing better. When the king takes the knight, now the king has been drawn away from protecting the queen. Black's queen would love to eat that white queen, but his own bishop is in the way. What's the first thing we look for every single move? Check. Now you have bishop f5 check. Now you're also threatening the queen. The king could come back, and then you could deflect him by giving the bishop on f2, and then you win the queen. In the actual game, black played an even simpler move here, better move too, because he wins a pawn. Bishop takes g3 check, right, which prevents the king from coming back and protecting the queen. And after white takes, black takes, and the party is just starting for black. So game over. Next game. In our next game, black plays maybe my favorite opening, the French defense. And white plays really badly against it, creating all sorts of disharmony, which will kill him on his weak spot. Here we go. Pawn to e4, pawn to e6. Black intends to put the d pawn on d5. It's always a good idea to have a pawn in the center, or usually a good idea to have a pawn in the center. And his pawn will be protected and threatening the white pawn. White brings up a pawn. Black brings up a pawn. White says, oh, you're threatening me? Let me protect myself. Most popular here is c5. In my own games, for full disclosure, I like to play knight c6. Knight f6 is the second most popular move, attacking the pawn again. Black played pawn to c5. So now he's threatening the other pawn. White trades, and then he should develop his bishop, I mean, develop his knight, bring up his bishop, and then castle. But instead, he did black a favor and he said, hey, black, I hear you want to develop your bishop. So he took the pawn and let black bring the bishop out right to a square where it is attacking the weak spot. Here, once again, white should play knight f3. Okay, I won't go into that too much. But instead he played knight to e2, which is, once again, look at the disharmony. This knight is jamming a bunch of people up. This knight is jamming a bunch of people up. Black to play. Now, we already have one attacker on the weak spot. What should black do here? If black plays queen h4, looking for queen f2 mate, yeah, white could block with g3. He stops the mate, opens up a square for his bishop, and then he'll be able to castle and get his king to safety. If black plays queen f6, going for the pawn, then he can play knight f3, untangling himself a little bit and blocking the attack. Does anybody see another way for black to help the bishop attack the pawn on f2? This is one of those pause moments. The move here is queen b6. Once black plays the queen on b6, he has two things attacking the weak spot. And he's threatening just straight up mate. If white tries to get his bishop out, thank you, game over, bishop f2 mate. If white pushes the pawn so he doesn't lose the pawn, same story. Actually, white's best defense here is to throw away. He could play knight f3, right, which looks like it gives the king an escape square, but this has another tragic ending, checkmate. And if here, white's best move is probably knight d4, believe it or not. His position is so bad that he has to give up a whole piece in order to bring somebody up to defend against the mate. Okay, next game. In our next game, black's king winds up with a very, very, very bad choice. And we're going to see an opening that's similar to one that we saw earlier. White played e4. Bobby Fischer, America's America's first world chess champion. The first great American chess player was a guy named Paul Morphy, but he was the best player in the world before they had like rankings and who was officially best. Bobby Fischer said about pawn to e4 here, best by test. Another grandmaster, Ernst Grunfeld, once said, e4, white's game is in his last throws. That is, he thought, but white is losing after e4, while Bobby Fischer is like, that's the best for me. Okay, white plays e4, black plays d6, perk defense. White goes d2, pawn to d4. Black should play knight f6 here, attacking the pawn. If white goes forward after the knight, that's what this guy's here for. Trade, let's rip the queens. White can't castle anymore. Unprotected pawn, knight g4. And now black is threatening to win a pawn here or take this pawn with a nasty, nasty fork. The best white can do is probably like king over, black takes. And now black still has 7 pawns, white only has 6. White has given up 2 pawns, black has given up 1. Plus black has a piece developed. Black is doing much better than white. Okay. But black played the inferior move, knight d7. Does anybody know what word comes to my mind when I see that? Disharmony. He's jamming up his development again. White played bishop c4. What should we think about? Attacks to the weak spot. Black prepares to fianchetto. White develops the knight, which is another useful attacker against the weak spot. In this game, black played, he developed his bishop, and now it's white to play. Does anybody see a good move for white? Actually, here's a better question. Does anybody remember the first thing you're supposed to look for every single move? Checks. And so let's examine the check. You've got bishop f7 check. Bishop takes the pawn on f7. If the king takes, then the knight can come in. And then the knight might get into this square going after the queen. Let's take a look. Bishop takes f7, king takes, knight to g5. If the king goes back to d8, well, this is a sad story for black. If the king goes back to f8, similar sad stories. And last but not least, what if the king runs up to f6? White to play. Pause moment. Queen f3 is checkmate. The queen comes up. Black, when you're in check, there's 3 ways out of check. Capture, block, run. Black cannot capture the queen. Black cannot put anybody in the way and block. And the king cannot run because those squares are controlled by white. Game over. Time for our next game. Our next game is a chess super duper classic. This game was played in Paris in 1750, and it includes a typical sacrifice that every chess player should know. Here we go. This is called Legal's sacrifice, and the guy playing white was, his name was like Kemur de Legal, but I could be pronouncing it wrong. Who knows? White played e4. Black said, I've seen that before. I'll play e5. White comes up with the knight, attacking the pawn. Black defends with a pawn. This is called Philidor's defense. The best move here for white is to continue your attack on the pawn. You play d4, adding another attacker. But in this game, white developed a bishop. We've seen this idea before, aiming at the weak spot. And black developed his bishop. And here we have a new idea. And this is, or actually a new idea in this section of the lessons, but an old one for another section that I did, which is all about this, which is called pinning. A pin is when a piece tries to hold another piece in place. Here, when the bishop goes to g4, black is saying to white, hey, white, you move that knight and my bishop is going to take your queen. White developed his knight, black pushed his pawn. White to play. Everybody take a good look. This is that pause moment. Now, notice black has an unprotected piece, the bishop that pinned. And white already has an attacker on the weak spot. Plus, he's got these other pieces that might help in our attack. Knight takes e5. Shocking move. Now, first of all, when the knight moves, right, the bishop is attacking the queen, but the queen is also attacking the bishop. So if the pawn takes the knight, the queen will take the bishop. And then white has won a pawn. He snatched a pawn here. And then he traded his knight for a bishop, which is a big gain for white. Plus, white now has 3 pieces developed, while black's got nothing going on. White's doing better than black. But the real fun begins with bishop takes the queen, bishop d1. Okay, everybody, pause. And here, I would love it if you could not just see the first move, but see the entire continuation. We're always looking for checks. And we'll look at check followed by check. Bishop takes the pawn on f7, check. The king will not be able to take the bishop because the bishop is protected by the knight. The king will not be able to go to d7 because the knight covers that square. So we're going to see bishop f7 check. The king has only one move. We pause for a second. That means everybody's brain should be whirring. I can almost smell the wood burning. And here, white plays knight to d5, checkmate. The knight comes up to d5, hitting the king, and the king has no place to go. And just one side thing, you can never block the check of a knight. So knights are especially nasty. One other version of this game would be like this. If white plays e4, black plays e5, white makes a horrible move, knight e2. Let's say black goes knight f6, attacking the pawn. White goes d3. Black goes bishop f5, aiming at the weak spot. White goes bishop g5. Okay, everybody, pause and think. Black to play. Notice we have the bishop attacking the weak spot. The white bishop is giving the pin, but once again, the white bishop is unprotected. Knight takes e4. Now the queen is attacking the bishop, so if the pawn takes the knight, we take the bishop, and we've won a pawn. We snatched a pawn here and then traded our knight for a bishop. But the real fun is what happens when the bishop takes the queen, and I would like to think that people are catching on here. The answer is bishop takes f2, checkmate. The king cannot escape because the knight is covering the d2 square. Here we go again. Here we're going to see an example of an opening called Vienna game, or here we go. e4, e5. develops the bishop, aiming at the pawn. Black develops, aiming. White goes knight c3, protecting. Now, black wants to put his pawn in the center, but he can't. If he puts his pawn in the center right now, white has 1, 2, 3 things attacking it versus only 2 protectors. Black would need a third person to help that pawn go up there. But he has a clever move. This is called the fork trick in chess. The knight takes on e4, and if white takes back, whoops, he can go pawn to d5, forking back the white pieces. So bishop takes, black gets his piece back, and black has a pawn that's better than white's center pawn. His center pawn is allowing his pieces to come out, while white's center pawn is blocking his pieces. There's also a funny variation where white goes here, queen h5, and he has the bishop, and he's threatening checkmate. Black plays the knight to d6, protecting the mate, attacking the bishop. The bishop retreats from the knight's attack. The queen's attacking the pawn here, so black plays knight c6, defending the pawn. White wants to mate with queen f7, but the knight on d6 is preventing it, so white plays knight b5, hoping that the knight will take, so he can take checkmate. But after knight b5, black kicks the queen. Now he wants to take the knight, and of course he's threatening the queen. White brings the queen back, looking for that checkmate idea again. If the knight takes, he has checkmate. Black plays pawn to f5, once blocking this attack, but then white goes queen to d5. And now white is threatening, like let's say black attacks the knight, white will get rid of the knight check, black will take back one way or the other, and then white has checkmate. So what happens here? Black has to play to defend the mate, to defend the mate because white's getting ready to get rid of the knight. He plays queen e7 to stop the mate, but queen e7 allows white to go knight c7 check, king here, knight takes the rook, and then black will play b6 followed by bishop b7, which will not only get the knight back, but will threaten the white queen. And we see stuff like, let's say we have knight f3, bishop b7, and just to show you the danger that white is in, let's say white castles here. Black to play. Everybody take a quick look. Does anybody see a good move for black? Black has a very nice move here. Knight to d4. Notice this. He moves the knight, attacks the queen. The queen's not going to take that bishop because the bishop is protected by the knight. And if we look at the white queen, there's no safe place to go. The queen can't go to any of these squares. The only place that looks sort of safe is the pawn on e5. Because you got 2 things attacking it versus only 1 defender, but there's a problem here. If the queen takes the pawn on e5, the queen is relying on this knight for protection, but black can get rid of it with a check and then say, thank you very much, I am now winning this game. But that was not what happened in this game. In in this game it was e4, e5. The bishop came out, the knight came out, the knight came out, takes. White gave a check. Black took back. White took the knight. What black should do here is play the pawn to d5, making his center, freeing more people, and kicking the knight. And then the knight will come back here, and then black will play a move like bishop to d6 so that he can put his rook on the open file and then tuck away his king. And black is doing fantastically. But instead, after the knight went here, black played knight f6. He brought up his knight. White came in with a check. Now, the queen, of course, isn't going to block. That's ridiculous. And black, I guess, should have tried king to e8. But instead, he played king to g8, maybe feeling it was safer in the corner. White to play, really nice move coming up by white. The king is in the corner, and notice this long diagonal leading to the king. If we gave a check, black could block the check with our pawn. So that doesn't really work. We need, but if check blocks and the queen wasn't there to protect, we could take the pawn check, the bishop would have to come out, and then we would take the bishop checkmate. So what white does here is white plays knight to g5. Now, this looks a little outrageous because the knight is unprotected and the black queen is staring right at it. But if the black queen takes, check, king can't come out. All he can do is block. And then it's goodbye, Charlie. Okay, next game. In our next game, we're going to see some nice tactics leading to the black queen getting trapped. White played pawn to d4. Black played pawn to c5. This is called a Benoni defense. What white should do here is play pawn to d5, gaining space, controlling space deeper in black's position, and taking away the best spot from black's knight on b8. Instead, he took the pawn. Not that great. And black should push his e-pawn here, like to e6 or maybe e5, and look to get the pawn back with the bishop. Instead, in this game, he said, well, I got a double attack. I got queen check, plus I can recover the pawn. So he goes queen a5 check. White develops a piece to block. The queen takes. The problem for black here now is that the queen can get kicked around on this square. White has moves like bishop e3 coming up, developing a piece and kicking the queen. But if we develop the bishop to e3, then we're blocking our e-pawn, which jams up the other bishop. So white plays e4, freeing up people, and he's preparing bishop e3 to develop a piece and gain time on the queen. Black played e5. White developed his knight. Black pushed the pawn, freeing up more people, and he's giving the pawn extra protection from the knight. White played knight to d5. And black challenged white's knight. Okay, really, 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 really nice move coming up. White to play. Everybody look at the position. To me, as a chess player, I played a long time. The black queen is just screaming at me because she's out there. And we're going to see that she doesn't really have a great place to go. We could kick the queen, I guess. The queen would give a check. We could block the check. Queen runs home. Doesn't really get us much. White to play. The knight helps us out here. Now the knight would love to get down to c7 and fork. So let's play pawn up to b4 here. The pawn is threatening the queen. If we look around, whoops, well, that doesn't look too safe to me, so I don't think black would do that. But if we look around, we only see one sort of safe place for the queen, queen c6. Now, this is one of those pause and look moments. Very, very, very typical tactic coming up for white. Remember, we look for double checks now first, then checks, captures, things lined up, things unprotected, what's my opponent's idea? This is a things lined up position. If we look at black's position, two most important people, the queen and the king, the royal couple, are lined up, which suggests a move, bishop to b5, right? Which would pin the queen to the king. But you might say, wait a second, nobody's protecting that bishop. Look a little further. If now the bishop is threatening the queen, right? If the queen takes the bishop, the knight goes to c7 check and recovers the queen. White is winning once again. And actually here, white also has the knight and the queen threatening this pawn. So the end is not far away for black. he could maybe do something like move his knight out of the way to give the bishop a little protection to the pawn, but then white just rips. And white is threatening to take this pawn with a check, give me the rook, and bishop takes, queen takes, check, king over, give me another pawn. White's having a party. Okay, next game. In our next game features a very nice attack, and it's sort of a variation on the legal mate that we saw earlier. Remember, the legal mate was e4, e5, knight f3, d6, bishop c4, bad pin, develops a piece, waste of time. Whoops. Remember this sacrifice. So we're going to see a version of that in this game. Here, white went e4, black went e5. White said, I want that pawn. Black said, I'll protect it. Once again, the best move for white here is d4. Adding another attacker to the pawn, right? And let's say black does something ridiculous, right? Takes. Now you can't castle. give me the pawn, and I have a threat. White's doing much better than black. Probably best for black would be bishop e6, developing a piece, but then white could just go bishop c4. Up material, looking to make trades, which is great for white. But instead of d4, this is older games, white played the bishop to c4 idea again, attacking the center. And this time black plays really risky move, f5, opening up his king, but also attacking the white center pawn. White blasted away in the center. Black developed his knight. White developed his knight. Black took, threatening white's knight. Oh, wait a second. Sorry. Black actually took this pawn. White took back with the queen. And then black made this weird move, bishop d7, and white goes knight g5. So now white is looking to bring the knight in here, forking the queen and the rook. Black developed his knight, threatening white's queen. And I would love it if you all would take a moment here and try to figure out white's attack, because it's really nice. What's the first thing we're looking at? We're always looking at checks first. I mean, white has checks like queen e5, but I don't see that being the road to success here. So let's start with bishop f7 check. The king can't take because it's protected by the knight, and the king has to come up. Now, we don't have the same mate as before because black is guarding it. He's stopping knight d5 mate because with his knight on f6. So what does white do? Hey, I'll just give up my queen for that knight. The queen takes on f6 check. If the pawn takes back, sayonara, this is checkmate. The king can't take the bishop and he can't go anywhere. And when the king takes, white continues the attack check. All black can do is come up. Remember, in positions like this, it's worth material to force the king up and out where he has no defense and it's easy to get at him. Everybody take a good look at this position. White to play and mate in 2. Mate in 2 is no matter what black does, you mate him in 2 moves. It's absolutely forced. Here, white brings the knight back to f3 check. The king has only 1 move, and then knight to c3 is checkmate. I love these games. I think they're very short, but they're also extremely instructive, and I hope you guys are getting something out of them. Okay, everybody. We're going to begin here with a King's Gambit that ends in under promotion. Usually when a pawn reaches the other end of the board, you promote to a queen. But there are situations where you'd rather promote to something else. Let's take a look. White plays e4. Black plays e5. White plays f4. The King's Gambit. Black takes the pawn. Now, we saw in an earlier game, white play knight f3, which is the best move here to stop the check. Second best move for white is bishop c4. This is called bishop's gambit. You allow the check, but you give your king a place to go. And later, you hope to make life uncomfortable for black when you bring up your knight and make him move his queen again. In this game, though, white simply played b3. He thought that he could just stop to smell the roses and develop his bishop, but things are critical for the king. What do we look for first? Checks. Here we go. Queen comes in check. Pawn blocks. The pawn took. And here, if the pawn takes back, whoops, you wouldn't give up the queen, but you would take the rook. But white played h3 here. And I would love it. Right. I would love it if everybody took a quick look at this position and saw if they could figure out what happens here next, because it's really nice. We're looking for checks first. Now, black does have queen e4 check, and you're also attacking the rook on h1. But white would play queen e2. And now the queen can't take, the queen can't zap the rook on h1 because the queen itself is pinned. So black looks for a better check. g2, check to you. The only way out is to move the king. Queen e4 check. Black plays king f2. White plays king f2. Black to play. Now, yeah, black would have a great game if he took the rook and made a queen. He's got two queens. The king's in danger. And you're threatening more checks. It's a great position for black. But once again, if you see a good move, look for a better one. The king can't go anywhere. The king, he can't go here. He can't go anywhere here. The only place he can go is g3. Black takes the rook, promotes to a knight. The knight says check to the king and also covers the escape square. Checkmate. Our next game is kind of a notorious one. The guy playing black in this game was named Reuben Fine. And Reuben Fine was from Brooklyn, where I'm actually filming this right now. And Reuben Fine was one of like the 5 best players in the world in the 1930s. He was and basically one of the strongest American players, but I don't think he ever actually won the U.S. championship. Here, he's playing in 1932, and he gets murdered, but I suspect that this game was part of a simul. That is, I think that Fine was probably playing a lot of people at once, and that this game just was a mistake. And here we go. Reuben Fine is black. So we can see even really strong players might not have great games now and then. White goes e4. Black goes knight f6. This is called Alyokin's defense. He's threatening the white pawn. Now, white can make moves like knight c3 and defend. I see a lot of people play d3, but why are we blocking our bishop? Best for white. Charge! Attack the knight. The knight wants to stay in the center. Notice if the knight goes to the wrong center square, our pawns can make serious advances while kicking that knight around. And having these pawns controlling squares above the black king will make it very hard for him to bring pieces out. So black doesn't want to do that. So after e5, black plays the knight to d5. White kicked the knight back. This is called the chase variation. And then white put his pawn in the center. Absolutely essential is to have a pawn forward to break, to stop this white advance. Black absolutely has to play d6 here. First of all, d6 contains a threat. If white does the wrong thing, like knight c3, black takes, rips the queen. And then white would have to take back with the knight, but then, white's not got anything going on. Instead of d6, though, black just developed another knight, and things go down here really quickly from there. Watch this. See this knight here? Doesn't have any good place to go. Charge! Attacks the knight. Black tries taking. Charge! Attacks the other knight. The knight goes to c4. Now, the bishop could take the knight, but the knight could take back. One easy win for white here would be just f4. You kick the knight. Thank you very much for the free piece. White's just winning the game. So black is basically already busted here. He's already lost. I think white just plays f4. And I think the actual game went something like e6, and he didn't take the knight because maybe he was worried about checks, but he played simply like queen d4. And now he's really threatening everything. First of all, you could go bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, which wins a piece that way. And I think black might have tried queen check, blocks, and then black played queen to h6. Does anybody see what Reuben Fine was trying to do here? Black is trying to save himself. He sees that he's lost. White wants to take the knight, but the queen is pinning the f pawn to the unprotected bishop on c1. So if white goes fe5, black has this. White simply could win once again. He could win a piece this way, a 2-for-1 deal, trade the one bishop for the 2 knights. In the game, he simply played knight to c3. After playing knight to c3, black is still busted. Now white is threatening to take the knight, and the queen can't take because the bishop is protected. Black is falling apart here. The knight's under attack. If you do that, you just lose other stuff. White's winning. Game over. It's an old story. Okay. let's look at another beautiful game. Here we go. White plays e4, and here we meet a new defense. This is called the Caro-Kann defense. The Caro-Kann defense is a cousin of the French defense, which we saw in one game earlier. The French plays e6, d5, attacking the white pawn. But in the French, your white squared bishop is blocked. In the Caro-Kann, black plays c6, so that after here, let's say white pushes the pawn, black can develop the bishop, and then he can push the other pawn. Like, let's say white goes knight f3, he can push the pawn, white develops, he hits the center, white protects, black is developing his pieces, and life goes on. Okay. In this game, after black played d4, d5, best move for white is probably e5 here these days, or knight c3. White played a little bit of a weird move, bishop d3. Black should take, and then challenge the bishop. But instead, black played knight f6. White charged forward, attacking the knight. Black's knight went back to d7. White to play, everybody. This is a nice one coming up. Does anybody see a good move for white? White wants to attack on this diagonal, but the pawn is blocking. Pawn to e6. After, if black moves the knight, which is actually best, the pawn will take, the king will take. And this isn't great for black because his king is exposed, and then white can play like knight f3, and black is going to be dealing with checks in the near future. But this was how black should have played. In the actual game, after e6, black took, and everybody should be calculating now. White to play. We're looking at the checks first. Bishop g6 check. I'm not so sure about that. But what about queen h5 check? Queen h5, check to His Majesty. The only way to block is to block. And here we could give up the bishop or the queen. More fun is to give up the queen and mate with the bishop. Next game. Let's take a look. This next game is an opening called the Nimzo Indian Defense. So we see a new opening. White plays d4. I want to put my pawn on e4. Black says, go ahead, make my day. I'll just take it. So white says, let me control more space with c4, stopping you from playing d5, because remember, we'll drag somebody to the center and then kick them around. Black played, in this game, he plays e6. White plays knight c3. He wants to put his pawn on e4. Now it's protected by the knight. Black plays bishop to b4. This is a pin. He pins the knight to the king, right? Now this knight cannot move. So if white makes his center with e4, black can just grab the pawn. Black and the knight cannot take. And black has won a free pawn, and it's an important pawn. He's got more pieces developed than white. He's ready to castle. Black's doing really well. So, so white can do a bunch of things here. White can develop his bishop. White can push the pawn. White can develop the knight. White can kick the bishop. In this game, he played another move. He played queen b3. So he threatens the bishop and protects his knight some more. And why is he protecting his knight some more? Because one of the threats that black has, let's say white does this, is to double up black's pawns, which are not necessarily a bad thing. White plays queen to b3, threatening black's bishop. Black plays c5, protecting his bishop. White plays a3. I want that bishop. Black plays queen to a5. Does anybody see what black is doing here? The pawn can take the bishop on b4. But what happens if the pawn takes the bishop? The queen will grab the rook. And since rooks are worth more than bishops, white didn't want to go for that deal. White played his bishop to d2. Black developed his knight, threatening the pawn. And now white played the queen back to d1. So the queen comes back to protect the rook, and now white is threatening to take the bishop black grabbed the pawn. Now, black actually is hoping that white will take the bishop on b4. Does anybody see, this is the pause moment, what happens here? If the pawn takes the bishop, notice black has this knight coming in with the potential fork. The queen will grab the rook. And then when white takes back, black comes in with a check. And then when the king moves, he grabs the queen. And then when we do a material count, we see black has 3 minor pieces, white has 3 minor pieces, each side has a rook. Black has a rook versus the remaining white knight. Black is up material, doing better than white. So here, black took the pawn, hoping that white would take the bishop. But instead, white simply said to himself, what is my opponent's idea? I can't take the bishop because he'll rip my rook and then hit me with the fork. So let me first just chase the knight away. And after he chases the knight, black is busted here. If black's knight goes back, white can take the bishop. And taking the rook now gives nothing to black because he doesn't have this fork. And after the knight comes back, the pawn just grabs the bishop. I guess the queen. If the queen grabs back, then white has another good move here. Knight b5, threatening the queen. Say the queen grabs the pawn. Are we trapping the queen? Almost. Bishop c3. Yeah, we trapped the queen. I was actually looking for knight c7 with a fork, figuring that was winning for white, but trapping the queen works too. I'll take that. Next game. In our next game, black actually plays an opening I played a lot of times, but he doesn't play it correctly. Here we go. White started out pawn to e4, black plays pawn to e5. White goes knight f3, black goes knight c6. White goes pawn to d4. This is a fundamental opening called the Scotch game. White now has the knight and the queen, enforcing him, making his nice center. He threatens, let's say black does once again nothing. I mean, he threatens to just give me the pawn. I'll take your pawn from you. I'll vic you. I'll take the pawn. I'll mug you for your pawn. After d4, black usually takes, white takes back. And now here, most popular for black are moves like knight f6 or bishop c5. But another move that I've actually played many times, and actually US champion Hikaru Nakamura has played this a bunch of times too, is queen h4. The queen goes to h4. It's attacking white's weak spot. It's hitting the white pawn on e4, threatening to take it with a check. If white went knight c3, developing and protecting the pawn. What black should play here is bishop b4, pinning the knight, right? And then he's threatening to take the pawn again, check. But when white played knight c3, black played knight f6. And his idea, I think, must have been to maybe bring the knight in and look for some kind of a shot on f2. White went back knight to white played knight to f5, attacking the black queen. When we look at the black queen, she has only a couple places to go. She could go to g4, but on g4, I guess white just plays like f3 and kicks the queen. Or once again, I have to check, is it this? Queen gets out. Okay, so white would just play f3. If the queen went to g4, I think white just plays f3 here. But after knight f5, queen to h5, which black actually played, big mistake, bishop to e2, attacking the queen, queen g6. White to play. Everybody look at the board. Look at that queen. How many places can she really go? She can't go to the dark squares because of the bishop and the knight. She can't go to g4 because of the bishop. Hanging out on g3 doesn't look like a great idea. But the queen can take the pawn on g2. White to play. Knight h4. The knight goes to h4, threatening the queen, and she has no place to go. She can't take the pawn on g2 now because the knight will just take her, and every other square is under watch. And of course, if you try taking a pawn, that's not going to work out too well. So the queen went back to g6, knight h4, trapped queen, game over.